First half of May 1942. The war is now covering all the oceans and a significant part of the Eurasian landmass. The civilian populations of China and Europe have already faced the suffering of war and occupation head-on. Now it is the turn of the populations of Southeast Asia as Japan advances its war of conquest at breakneck pace. This is War Against Humanity, a subseries of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. In the second half of April 1942, we saw how Germany raided historic British cities and the British bombed the German port of Rostock to smithereens. Anti-partisan or anti-civilian actions were conducted in Belarus and the Balkans. Meanwhile, Jews in Western and Central Europe are increasingly alienated in their own communities, gaslighting people to accept deportation of their Jewish neighbors to the east, where the Sobibor extermination factory is ready for operation. A lot of that continues in May 1942. Operation Trio, the anti-partisan operations in the Balkans, is concluded on May 13th. The Baedeker Blitz continues with new raids on Exeter, killing 164 people on the night of May 3rd and 4th. Prime Minister Winston Churchill mentions those raids and the British simultaneous raids over Germany in his address to the British nation on May 10th, the second anniversary of his prime ministership. You will remember how the German propaganda films seeking to terrorize neutral countries and glorifying and devastating violence were wont to show rows of great German bombers being loaded up with bombs and flying in the air in battle array, then casting down showers of bombs upon defenseless towns and villages below, choking them in smoke and flame. All this was represented from the beginning of the war to neutral countries as the German way of making war. Those days are gone. Now is the time to use our increasingly superior air strengths to strike hard and continually at the home front in Germany, from which so much evil has leaked out upon the world and which is the foundation of the whole enormous German invasion of Russia. And while that German advance in Russia has stalled for now, in Southeast Asia, Japanese occupation begins. On May 8th, the Philippines are under full Japanese control. On May 20th, Burma too will be fully occupied. Other territories, like the Dutch East Indies, have already been under Japanese rule for a while, giving some insight into what a Japanese occupation might look like. The Dutch, in the Dutch East Indies, had been expecting that their colonial administrative system would be left intact and used by the Japanese occupiers, as is the case in the Netherlands under German occupation. Because of this assumption, the majority of Dutch civilians and civil servants remain on the islands when the Japanese arrive. Well, they were wrong. The Japanese military instead takes administrative control over the entire archipelago. Their 25th Army assumes control over Sumatra and Malaya. The 16th Army seizes power in Java, while the eastern islands and Kalimantan, rich in oil, are now under the Imperial Navy's authority. Thousands of Dutch government functionaries and police officials are immediately interned. In time, this will be the fate of most of the roughly 100,000 Dutch, Indonesian, Chinese, and other alien men, women, and children on the islands. Their imprisonment will be characterized by poor living conditions and cruel treatment by the Japanese guards and secret police. It is all part of the contempt that imperial Japanese culture holds for the defeated. As we have seen, this contempt is all the more expressive towards fighting men who let themselves be captured instead of fighting to their deaths. Tens of thousands of soldiers from the various United Nations alliance members now become part of a system of discipline and punishment that is very different from other armies. The Japanese army is organized through a trickle-down of violent obedience. Aggression is passed down with increasing force of corporal punishment for disobedience, even random acts of violence as simple intimidation. The system is especially aggressive within the Kempeitai. the military and secret police who are in charge of both civilian internment and POW camps. The lowest level in this hierarchy of abuse is the prisoner of war. Slightly above them, the interned enemy civilian, and just above them are the Japanese guards. On May 15, 1942, the Japanese start to outsource this dishonorable work by recruiting auxiliary guards in Korea and Taiwan. They are seen as racially inferior to their Japanese masters, but superior to POWs, especially the Caucasian prisoners. Now, those guards are often forcibly conscripted, making them both victims of the Japanese Empire and perpetrators of her war crimes. The initiative for abuse starts at the top of the pyramid. In the last days of April 1942, Japanese Prime Minister and Minister of War Hideki Tojo argues to War Ministry officials for a relief of the Japanese population's heavy contribution to the war effort by engaging enemy prisoners in forced labor. A few weeks later, Tojo explains that we have our own ideology concerning prisoners of war, which should naturally make their treatment more or less different from that in Europe and America. Many prisoners, as well as hundreds of thousands of indigenous inhabitants of the occupied territories, will now be used as expendable forced laborers. On May 14th, 3,000 Australian POWs leave their prison in Singapore for Burma, where they will start the construction of a railroad from Burma to Thailand. As they arrive in Burma, further to the north, a refugee crisis is in full swing. On top of the native Burmese ethnicities, Burma is home to 1.2 million Indian immigrants and a few 10,000 Europeans or Burmese of European descent. The British colonial government and military have been anticipating a potential evacuation of non-Burmese civilians since early 1941 in case of war with Japan. Unfortunately, their preparations have been plagued by infighting between the three people in charge. The governor of Burma, Reginald Dorman Smith, has appointed P.C. Fogarty, British Commissioner for the Shan states of northern Burma, to take charge of the overall civilian response to an invasion. But evacuations are in the hands of the Director of Civilian Evacuation, J.S. Vorley. The three of them cannot agree of who is in charge for what, and while the Japanese bombed Rangoon and Mandalay in December, January, and February, they are still quibbling over responsibilities while lower-level administrators do what they can to prepare. Meanwhile, the military response is crumbling, and when Fogarty dies in a plane crash in February, chaos is complete. The initial idea had been evacuation by boat, but preparations for this have now largely failed. From the time that Rangoon is bombed over Christmas 1941 until it falls in March, about 60,000 refugees do get away on boats to India, while another 100,000 or more cram into trains, roads, and carts headed for Mandalay. Barely have they arrived and started crowding into the makeshift camps erected by Vorley in Mandalay, do the Japanese start their bombing campaign there. The Irrawaddy River that connects Mandalay to Rangoon and then the Indian Ocean is now under Japanese control, so evacuation by boat has become impossible. When Mandalay falls on May 1st, the higher officials and a few thousand Europeans and well-to-do Indians have already managed to flee on planes or the last boats. Another 12,000 European and 400,000 or more Indian civilian men, women, and children now have to evacuate north on foot via roads and paths through the jungle towards India. The Burma Corps under Bill Slim and the Chinese Expeditionary Force under Joe Stilwell are also evacuating along the same paths and fighting off the Japanese in pursuit to their rear. The civilians clog the roads, hindering the fighting, and occasional bombs dropped by the Imperial Japanese Air Force hit into the columns of civilians, killing hundreds. There is no food, fresh water is scarce, and disease is rampant. As many as 30% are soon critically ill with dysentery, smallpox, malaria, or cholera. To make things worse, some of the Chinese troops, also lacking food and water, start looting from the refugees. By the most probable calculation, at least 80,000 of the civilian refugees die before they reach India, where, as we shall see, in June, Their trials and tribulations are not over. In Europe, the trials and tribulations of the Jewish population is also seeing no end. On May 15th, the Slovakian parliament approves Decree 68/1942, which retroactively makes the deportation of Slovak Jews to Poland legal. The Slovakian Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wojtek Tuka, is so eager to rid Slovakia of Jews that he agrees to pay Germany a fee of 500 Reichsmark for every deported Jew, on the condition that they shall never return. Few will. There, in Poland, in early May 1942, 2 more extermination camps start to systematically gas large groups of men, women, and children. To the systematic gassing of Jews, Sinti, and Roma that began in Chełmno and Bevcec, the killing factory at the mixed concentration, labor, and extermination camp Auschwitz-Birkenau now starts operating at capacity on May 4th, and Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss' workflow of murder becomes visible. Upon arrival in Auschwitz, able-bodied Jews, Roma, and Sinti, as well as communists, Poles, homosexuals, and other undesirables, are singled out for hard manual labor. The Jews, Roma, and Sinti, who are children, women with small children, pregnant women, elderly, or appear to not be completely fit and healthy, are separated from the herd already at the industrial train platforms. From there, they are immediately scuffled along to one of the gas chambers where they are killed with toxic Zyklon B pellets. That's about 3/4 of all arrivals. The remaining quarter, who are ruled fit to work, are expected to work until they're either dead or too weak to work, when they too will be gassed. In essence, all arriving Jews, Roma, and Sinti are condemned to die one way or another. A few days after Auschwitz starts industrial-scale gassing, the facility at Sobibor also comes online. Here, the sole purpose is exterminating the Polish Jewry. Sobibor's commandant, Franz Stangl, has received advice from the chief of Bevcec, Commandant Christian Wirth, and follows a similar model. Dov Freiberg, one of the very, very few Jewish survivors, tells us, Germans and Ukrainians opened our freight cars and expelled us. It was May 15, 1942. We were taken through a gate into a square surrounded by barbed wire. We were separated there, men on the one side, women and children on the other. After a short period, the women and children were taken away by SS men. Where they were taken to, we did not know, but we could hear screams and laughter of the SS men when they undressed. Another survivor, Ada Lichtmann, tells us what is going on there. Oberscharführer Michel, standing on a small table, convinced the people to calm down. He promised them that after the baths, all their belongings would be returning to them, and that it was time for Jews to become productive elements. At present, all of them would be going to the Ukraine to live and work. This address aroused confidence and enthusiasm among the people. They applauded spontaneously and sometimes even danced and sang. Back at the square, Freiberg tells us what he witnesses. Afterwards, we heard a mixture of noises, a running engine, the playing of an orchestra. We were kept overnight. It was terrible. The Ukrainians hid us and did not allow us to go to the toilet. We had to relieve ourselves sitting on the spot. They told us that nothing bad would happen to us and that the women had already been sent to work. In the morning, some SS men appeared and selected skilled workers. Then they pointed out some young and strong men. I was among them. Freiberg, like a handful of victims who arrive in May 1942, managed to survive, at least for a while, by being assigned to a work detail. But the selection for work is also used as a cover for something more sinister. Herschel Zuckermann arrives on May 13th and manages to convince the Germans that he is a cook. However, every few minutes, some SS men approached and inquired who among us was a shoemaker, tailor, etc. People believed it was worthwhile to appear as a skilled worker and therefore responded. Then they marched in groups consisting of 300 to 400 men who believed they were being sent to a labor camp. Actually, they were taken directly to Camp 3, to the gas chambers. Across the world, on the front lines, under the roofs of British and German towns, within besieged Soviet cities and Balkan villages, inside the forests of Belarus, across the hills of China, on Pacific Islands, along the roads from Mandalay, and in the gas chambers in Poland, the ticking clocks of human lifespans are being silenced prematurely by the thousands every hour. Not at the regular, slow pace of natural human demise, but to the violent, erratic beat of hatred and the screaming chants of intolerance. It scares me to think that even now, this danse macabre has not reached its crescendo. Never forget.